Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the community information session to initiate a transparent community dialogue to inform you about school governance, the role of the board, and potential impact of by-area trustees. My name is Sandy McCulloch. I'm superintendent for the Jefferson Elementary School District. And on our panel today, we have our school board president, Shakil Ali. We also have Paul Mitchell from Redistricting Partners and our moderator, Nicole Anderson. We also have translation with Regina. I would also like to acknowledge one of our governing board members, Trustee Aaron Roshbaugh. We also have a former board member, Clayton Koo, who is joining this virtual session today. As a listener, the trustee is listening. This session is being recorded, as you know, and will be available on our district website for the public to view later this week. Our district's vision is welcoming, engaging, and safe schools with a mission of providing all students a high-quality education in a safe and nurturing environment where each student demonstrates a spirit of respect, responsibility, and a commitment to academic and civic excellence. Our governing board is committed to this vision and mission as well as effective governance. And part of effective governance is hearing from the community about issues that affect them. So our governing board is considering transitioning to a different way of electing board members based on the 2001 California Voting Rights Act. Some other districts in San Mateo County have transitioned to by trustee area elections, and the Jefferson Elementary School District Governing Board is considering the positives and unintended consequences of this. In August, we contracted with Redistricting Partners to conduct a racially polarized voting analysis for our district to determine if there were any voting blocks of candidates from protected classes, which is the reason for the California Voting Rights Act. And the results were mostly low or insignificant levels of racially polarized voting occurring in our district. And a summary of this report is also available on our district website under Governing Board, California Voting Rights Act, so you can get to it there. At the October 9th Governing Board meeting coming up, the board will hold a public hearing for any member of the public to provide input to the board on continuing at-large elections, which we are now, or transitioning to by-trustee area elections. So our purpose today is to share with you some information about elections and then answer any questions you may have so you are more informed if you choose to provide your input to the school board on October 9th. So at this time, I will turn this over to our moderator, Nicole Anderson, who will guide us through today's session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sandy. We appreciate having an opportunity to join you all today and play the role of moderator for this information session. I do want to make sure that interpretation is set up well, and all of our community members who need interpretation are good to go. So just checking in with Regina Martinez that we are all good to go for Spanish interpretation. All right. And so at this time, I want to just give you a little context of how we're going to do our session today. A couple of things is, one, we are going to have all of you as participants be muted until we get to a space where we're going to do live Q&A so that our panelists can answer questions that you have. We do have questions that we will use to guide our discussion today, but do want to make sure that there is an opportunity for you to ask questions that you may need to have answered during this time. There is a Q&A option for you that you can hit the button on your screen and actually type in any questions that you have as well. We also want to make sure that this space is one where we recognize that elections is near and dear to many of our community members. And in our discussion, we want to make sure it is also what we call a safe space to engage in a conversation about something as important as our district elections. And so I often say, as a facilitator during our time, I want to make sure that this is a space where everyone who is involved in our time today, that we ask that everyone is what we call stays engaged, experiences a little discomfort, because sometimes we're going to learn something new, that we ask everyone to speak their truth, meaning that every perspective matters, and it's super important that when we come together, especially during a political democratic process, that everyone's truth really be heard, but also that they may cause a little discomfort when we hear different perspectives, but ultimately be okay with the journey that we're on together to ensure that all of our students have that safe and welcoming space. We know that the role of a governance team is super important in that process and the election process as well. And so we know sometimes there may be some non-closure as we go through journeys of dealing with conversations that may often be uncomfortable, but it's always important that it's safe. And so I always like to share that little context as we get ready to have our discussion with our community members. Um, I do want to take a moment to also acknowledge the land, and we call it labor and ancestor acknowledgement. Just knowing that as we talk about shifting how we govern in a school district, we always want to recognize our Indigenous brothers and sisters, ensuring that acknowledgement of the land and recognizing the harm and pain of the past is always at the forefront of our memories, and that collectively moving forward, we want to make sure that we honor our current and our past of Indigenous brothers and sisters based on the land, and particularly in Daly City, where we reside for in our district. And so I do want to make sure you understand why we're here. As Superintendent McCulloch just shared, we have some conversations we're going to have today. The purpose is to answer these questions, make sure that the community is very well aware of the role of a school board. So what does a school board actually do? We're going to talk about how school board members actually work together. We're going to talk about elections, as mentioned earlier, and how do school board members actually represent the community for Jefferson Elementary School District. We're going to talk a little bit more about the bi-trustee area elections. So we have our panelists who are going to really go deeper into those discussions, and of course talk about the pros and the cons. And so that as we get move forward into the community input session in October, you will have information to help support that discussion. And so before we get started, I do want to make sure that I have an opportunity again to acknowledge our panelists, but also want to know who's in our community that's joining us today. And so again, we are joined by Board President Shaquille Ali, Sandy McCulloch, who is our superintendent, and also Paul Mitchell, the CEO of Redistricting Partners, and what we often say, demographer, who helps us understand how school districts are broken up in those spaces around the elections. And so I also want to take a moment to have a quick poll shared for those that are on the call today. If you can just quickly just share who's in the room. And so I'm going to ask Tony, you can see on the screen, Tony, who's our amazing support behind the scenes. We really appreciate your support on this, on the Zoom. But we want to know who's here. And so if you can take a moment to just share, are you a community member? Are you from the faith-based community? Do you represent our staff within the district? Are you a student? Any parents or caregivers? And also, are you a district partner? And lastly, are maybe an elected official? So we just want to take a moment for you to just vote real quick in this poll so we can know who's in the room, and just want to acknowledge anyone who is also going to be watching this recorded webinar, that we acknowledge each of you for participating and joining in this discussion and reflecting on the things that you learn about governance, in particular the elections. We just take a moment to have that poll. All right, so it's like we have community members. So appreciate you joining us. So we have two parents. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And then one elected official. Again, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it. And so we hope that all of you who are joining us actually will have a great opportunity to engage in our discussion today about governance. And so I'm going to go ahead and just reshare so that we can move into our discussion. And so let's start just real quick. Like, what do boards do? Okay, and so I'm going to start with a little context, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to jump in and share a little context. So I often get an opportunity to train school board members, and we call them governance teams, because they work closely with their superintendent. And a lot of times what people don't realize is as we go to these meetings for school boards, we often don't recognize like what is the role of the board and what is the role of the superintendent. So we often have to remind people that the role of the board actually is the governing authority. They set policies, they actually set the vision, the goals, they monitor and evaluate the outcomes. And ultimately, they are the actual what we call boss of the superintendent. So they have one employee, and that is the superintendent. And often people don't always think of it that way. The superintendent has what we call designees, and those are the different staff members across the school district. But what does the superintendent do? Well, their role is actually, you can see that dotted line, which is really helpful to see. They work as a team, but the role of the board is to really have oversight. The role of the superintendent is to take those recommendations of how to implement those policies. So again, governance teams set policy, superintendent implements those policies through plans, and then also gives recommendations to the school board so that there is an ongoing relationship around how to make decisions on behalf of students and also on behalf of what's best for staff and of course the entire district and community. So this governance clock is often a great way to think about the role of the board and the role of the superintendent. Also, it's important to think about some of the roles and responsibilities. And so you can see these are some specific things, right? There's some real general things that boards do. And so it's really, really important to see that there are some delineated roles. And so as we're looking at the role of the board, you can see that there's ways that we adopt policy. Then there's the suggestion the superintendent makes, the board meetings, right? Those are the board are in charge of those, right? And also they adopt and monitor the budget, which is a big deal for school board members, a huge responsibility. The superintendent actually prepares those budgets and actually administers and monitors those, and again, makes recommendations. And you can also see instruction and curriculum. There are policies that the school board adopts that actually establishes the criteria for curriculum. And of course, the superintendent, in working with the designees, actually makes recommendations and implements that curriculum. A couple of other things, personnel, right? So we talked about the superintendent is the one employee of a school board, but we also know that our school boards actually establish through personnel policy, they establish criteria, they actually approve or reject when we think about the contracts that come forward or hires. But in particular, the superintendent actually does the hiring, right? The interviewing often works with the HR department to do that. You can see as you go through the community relations, right? Labor relations, student services. These are all things a board adopts policy, but the superintendent and designees actually monitor and implement and make recommendations around those. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And sometimes for those that go to school board meetings, you see that big agenda. Sometimes we don't realize what is going on, but there's a lot of things that are also governed by law, education code, and you will see also that there's a couple of responsibilities of school board members that they have to also adhere to. Here's a resource that if anyone's interested in really learning about school board members or ever in the future are interested in running, we always recognize and recommend that the Governance Core book is a great resource for school board members to understand what good governance looks like. And often if it's easy to remember, it's like managing, like rowing, like steering a ship, and managing is like rowing, right? And so these are examples that are used in our book that we often use with school board members when doing trainings. But again, real easy to see that governance is very complex, but a super important piece of the work that happens in the school district. And so what does that look like? Here's a couple of things again, just to give a little context. It's important that good governance happens. So this is why board members go through professional learning. So sometimes when we're not sure why board members do that, it's because we want to make sure we're really effective. So you can see there's a couple of things that show up around what good governance looks like. And ultimately, this now impacts the outcomes for students. And so just want to take for a moment, just pause for a minute and with our panelists, our amazing panelists, I want to just allow them for a moment before we talk about elections and representation. I do want to ask our panelists to just chime in a little bit about what you feel around the importance of the role of the school boards and like what is the ways that school boards function, right? And so I just want to pause for a moment and just allow maybe our president, Shakil Ali, if you want to chime in just for a moment to share any context around the importance and the role of a school board and your perspective in that area.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so as a school board trustee and president of the board for the Jefferson Elementary School District, I think a big part of it for me is ensuring that every student in our community has access to a high quality education. And another thing that I prioritize, and I know our board prioritizes, is that, excuse me, we want the students to be in a safe and supportive and also equitable environment. You know, as far as my role, you know, like you said, we oversee the district's policies and budget and provide direction. But we also make sure that we are listening and hear the voices of the parents, the teachers, the students, and the whole community. And then we take all those voices and consider all sides of the issues before we make our decisions.
Appreciate that. Powerful. Appreciate it. And one of the things I appreciate that you shared is students at the center of those decisions, right? Super important. I really appreciate working with your board and always having that at the forefront, because often people don't realize those decisions when boards take action at regular board meetings. There's a lot that goes into those decisions, a lot of information that's been shared from superintendent and staff. And so making the decisions what's best for kids, I just truly appreciate you sharing that. Superintendent McCulloch, do you want to share a little bit about your perspective about kind of what boards do and like how you all work together, you and your staff with school board members?
Sure, yes. What President Ali said about being a listener, I feel like that's a big part of being a board member, is listening to the community, listening to the reports that come from the staff so that they can make an informed decision. I think that's the biggest part of being a board member, is hearing from the community and listening to all aspects, hearing from the students, hearing from the staff, hearing from parents, hearing from the community. So I think that's a big part of governance, is being a great listener. Working with the board, governance is not just the school board. A governing board or governance is really the superintendent and the school board working collectively with a shared mission and vision. And our vision of welcoming, engaging, safe schools is a big part of that, where we all want to do what's best for our students and keeping students at the forefront of our thinking. And as you said earlier, the school board is really about, that high level view, that helicopter view of the district, and they oversee and look to see, what's happening. And then, with me as a superintendent, it's just to actually, where they see issues and where they see what needs to be taken care of or addressed, then me and my designees, meaning my assistant superintendents, my directors, et cetera, and staff, that we're the ones that are actually doing the work. We also are the ones that are deep in the system, and so we see things as well. And so we do make a lot of recommendations to the board based on what we see and what we hear, and then the board gets to make those decisions. So that's really what I wanted to add in to what President Ali said.
Yeah, well said. I really appreciate that. I always love the concept of a governance team, right? It definitely is where superintendents are working closely with the board as well as the staff. And it's complex, but it's an amazing process that keeps you're really centered around what's best for kids. And so I just want to echo that and thank y'all for that. I'm going to jump into another piece of the puzzle, right, around governance, and that's around elections. And so I'm going to actually share a little context, and I'm going to ask Paul to jump in on this piece just to share, because you are the expert that gets to work with boards around just this process of like representation, right? Like, what is this whole election process, right? And so just reminding people a little context is, the election process for school board members is like any other, where it's a democratic process that we use across our nation. Simple things like, to be a board member, you have to be 18 years old, you have to be a citizen, a resident of the district, you have to be a registered voter. So those are all criteria. But also it can't be someone who's employed by the district. And so that's often something that people have to consider as well. We often joke, I have a colleague, also we joke a lot about, you have to be popular enough to be voted in though, right? And so being 18, those criteria are great, but you got to also be popular enough to be voted in, which means there's some campaigning involved. And there are rules that apply to that. We won't go into details about that, but there are deadlines, there are monitoring of funds that can be collected around fundraising, you name it. So there's some rules that apply to this, but definitely those rules include something that people have to consider is this cycle, right? Every 4 years, you'll see elections happen, but there are also in between, there may be vacancies and there may be some rotations that happen where people might be appointed by a school board if there is a vacancy. And so you'll often see in that cycle of 4 years, there may be 2 years, there might be someone coming on, going off. So it's always, things are kind of always ebbing and flowing. But we definitely appreciate the opportunity for our voters to make decisions on who's represented. In the state of California, most districts have about 5 to 7 school board members. In some states around the nation, you have had 11, you've had 13. It's a nice number. But California, typically about 5 to 7 is what we see. And often you'll see what we call at-large spaces where school board members are representing the entire district. And then you have in other places areas where we call them by trustee area, where you have a school board member who is representing one area of the district. And so there are some laws and protocols that boards have to follow. So sometimes the community may not always realize that at meetings, those are governed by things like the Brown Act and open meeting laws. So there are rules to that, right? And so that's why you see meetings very structured. When public comment happens, these are all things that are part of the process of being on a school board. And so I want to ask Paul Mitchell, just appreciate you joining us. If you want to add any context to the election process, because this is so important when we talk about being a school board member, the impact of elections. And so if you want to add any context for us.
Sure. So first off, when we think about school board elections, it is about representing a community or representing the district as a whole. When people are getting elected to these boards, they are being seated as a board member as an expression of the public will to have that person in that seat. A little history is that in California, a lot of our election systems for cities, even San Mateo County used to be at large. A lot of the agencies had elections where when they were created, they would have these what's called an at-large election where, say, for 5 seats in one election cycle, they would elect 2 people for 4-year terms. And then the next 2 years, they'd elect 3 people for 4-year terms. And everybody is elected by the entirety of the city or the county or the district. That in the progressive era in California in like the 1920s was seen as a reform of what was a prominent system on the East Coast. On the East Coast, as we remember from high school political science, they had ward systems. And where they had ward systems, they had these things called ward bosses, where they had political corruption that would happen because, say, Chicago, they have 50 council districts, and each council district would be small enough that like a union boss or a political group or some other individual could control the election, have enough control over votes to, have political patronage and a lot of corruption that came out of districted elections, say, on the East Coast. So in California, they said, well, we're going to get rid of those. We're going to have at-large elections to try to dilute the political power of any small group that might seek to, corrupt the system. Fast forward 100 years, and you'll have areas around the state, like we'll pick on Southern California, let's say Anaheim, where none of the small communities in the Latino community downtown Anaheim have political power. The political power and in the at-large election in Anaheim allowed only the affluent councilman, the affluent members of the community to elect candidates. And the same law or reform that tried to dilute the ability of small communities to have too much political power ended up also diluting the ability for certain minority communities to have any political power. And so the state came in and said, okay, if you're in a situation like Anaheim was, or West Covina was an early example, a lot of cities and counties all around the state have examples, then we're going to require that you go to districts and that you go to districts that allow districts to be created in a way that these different communities that might be disenfranchised by the at-large system can now be empowered by a districted election system. And hundreds of cities, school boards, special districts, dozens even in San Mateo County have converted in the last 20 years to districted election systems. San Mateo County itself is a good and I think important example. San Mateo County used to be 5 supervisors elected countywide. Who was it that had real concerns about it? A civil rights community, the Filipino community, the Asian community felt as though that system was diluting their political strength because they weren't able to elect candidates of choice in that at-large system. So San Mateo County, based on a grand jury decision, was forced to put a ballot measure up and convert to a district election system for the county supervisors. So what that means for the governance, what that means for a smaller school district, it essentially means that when you go to districts, that you're able to have individual school board members that live in a smaller part of the overall district, and that they are elected by residents who live in that portion of the school district. And instead of voting for maybe 2 school board members one year and 3 the next. You're just voting for one school board member, and you're voting for that school board member every 4 years. So a different election system, but devised to try to empower smaller communities. And in the context of the California Voting Rights Act, focusing on minority communities that might have their voting power disenfranchised by the at-large system.
Wow. Powerful. No, I appreciate that historical context and looking at the importance of representation and the political power that's needed, and why there's a consideration of moving to by-area trustees. I want to ask Paul to add a little context to this conversation. There were a couple of superintendents and board members, school board presidents that gave a little testimonial about their experiences. So I love that you shared a couple of examples. And so there were some pros and cons that I asked them about. And so I definitely want to see if you can give a little context. But there were 4 districts we looked at. And you can see they're all different sizes. So I know that that matters too, right? The size of the community. So you have some very small ones, elementary districts, and some larger comprehensive. And so from these, we had Vista and Washington and Vallejo. These are all, Vista's actually in the San Diego area. And then Washington and Vallejo are more in that Northern California. And then Soquel is towards that Santa Cruz area. But I asked about pros and cons. And so just out of curiosity, these were a couple of things that came up. It's kind of some themes, right? And so definitely Paul wanted to ask you, give a little context to some of the things that are shared and the experiences of these are all boards also that I got to work with as a trainer, and they all shifted to the by trustee but there were some different versions of how that looked. And so you shared a couple of these, greater access to representation, right, of their constituents. That might not happen in the at-large election. So you shared that. Kind of equity of voice came up, right, and maybe removing that possibility of majority being from one neighborhood. Definitely the board members can also, in spaces like this, the pros of having the by-area trustee is they can focus on a small segment of the city that may need specific needs met. That's harder to do when you're looking at a broad district and city focus. Definitely, the possibility of having one person automatically appointed could be possibly a pro, but also it does depend on without that election, but it depends on the cost. And I know that when we're talking about affluent communities and resources to be able to run for an election, sometimes that could be a concern. The proactivity piece, because you mentioned lawsuit, right? And the grand jury. So definitely being proactive, right? And not being at risk of a costly lawsuit, which could actually mandate people to go into that space. So I see a lot of boards being proactive. But ultimately, integrating the board, having diverse representation with lots of perspectives, and in some cases, stabilizing the board so that it's less polarized, right, in some communities. So I don't know if you want to give any context to your experience. These are some basic experiences around the pros of it. And we can definitely talk about the cons in a moment, but want to get your thoughts on that. And then we'll go to the cons.
Sure. I think this is a great list of pros. I will say, and maybe this is diving too much into the cons already, but a lot of people who have fears about this transition system will say, like, is this going to fix our problems as a board because we're dysfunctional, or is it going to cause dysfunction on our board? And I don't have like a big research study behind me to give this insight, but I'll just tell you from my anecdotal evidence of working for over 100 district agencies and doing conversions for about 40 of them. If a board is highly functioning, communicative, working for the interest of the entire district, when they convert, they stay that way.
Yes.
The board is dysfunctional, bickering, fighting, unable to kind of collectively achieve goals, and you go to districts, they largely stay that way. A lot of times, the district election system is not a remedy or a cause of dysfunction. It's a reflection of a culture that might be there no matter how the election system is created. But I do think that, the number one issue on this is the idea of representation, and that is the goal of the California Voting Rights Act. We've seen research that shows that when we have district election systems, there's 3 types of improved representation. One is ethnic representation of board members. The second is geographic representation. And the third might not be obvious right away, but it's age representation. A lot of boards that are in at-large election systems that don't have a lot of competitive elections we'll end up having board members who have served on that board for 20 or 30 years.
Right.
And a lot of 70 or 80-year-olds. I'm not saying that's the case on this board, but I'm just saying in general, when we're talking about generalities.
Yeah.
The first conversion I ever did was for a community college district in the Coachella Valley, where every board member was over 70 years old and white. And I went back a few years ago and looked, and I think 4 of the board members are now in their 30s, and I think 4 of them were Latino and 1 was white. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything is solved, but it does mean that the opportunity for people to seek those offices, the opportunity for people to get elected to those offices can dramatically change.
Absolutely.
One thing that I don't think is on here is that school district elections get cheaper.
Yeah.
You're more likely to be able to win a school district election knocking door to door in a grassroots campaign in a smaller jurisdiction than you would in a citywide or district-wide election system.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that I think I've seen a lot people talk about as positive.
Great point. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I got to manage a couple of school board member campaigns, and definitely that at large, there was a big difference from the first time to the second. And it was definitely different. Just the amount of effort that has to be put into the process. I definitely want to ask you about the cons, because I think that's important too. And these were all themes from 4 districts who actually went through the process. They are all still in the by-area trustee. And actually, I think functionality, I appreciate you saying that, is they all function pretty well right now too. And so I think it's a powerful opportunity, but also there's some cons to this, right? There's some things that may not work well. And these are things that came up as well as, potentially you could have nobody run in the area. And I know I've seen that in the community that I actually live in, as well as that you could have an opportunity where there would be no one available to run. And so then that would create, possibilities of having to actually having someone appointed, which is really a tough process. So that's always can be challenging. Definitely, it's not always beneficial for smaller districts, right? Sometimes the representation looks very different when you're looking at very tiny districts, and the impact may not be as significant. And then there can be, a tendency to be an area trustee where you are voted by a portion of constituents in the district. So you might feel that you want to focus just on your constituents and not the whole district. And that is something definitely I've heard boards talk about, is how do we really make sure that we focus on our constituencies, because there's a representation of voices, but also that we don't forget that our job as a governance team is to govern for the whole district. And that can definitely be a challenge where sometimes there's some conflicts with board members because of my district or my area, I should say. Sometimes the under-resourcing is pretty challenging. And I think you had mentioned this earlier. So sometimes the more affluent influences, right, can sometimes fund elections based on the different portions of a city. And so that can often make it a little bit unbalanced, if that makes sense. And then, people can get frustrated. They might like board members, they want to vote for them, but because they don't live in their area, they can't. And so that can also come up. And so I don't know if you want to add anything to the cons, right? But these are some themes that came up from those districts.
Well, I'll address each of these, and then maybe along the way, I'll think of some other cons. But first off, this one concern at the top is something that comes up a lot because people will say, oh, nobody ever runs from that part of town.
Yep.
So like if we created a district there, we wouldn't have any candidates. And one like real good example of this that I remember was the city of Woodland, which is around Sacramento area. And there's literally Main Street. Yep. And south of Main Street, they say nobody ever runs from south of Main Street. Yep. And it was a more Latino portion, more low income portion, and so on. And my response, and I was being very glib because I wasn't working for this agency. I was just talking with the attorney on it. And I was like, maybe they don't run because they're smart, because they know that the political power is with the people in the northern part of the city. The people who are going to get the endorsements from the Democratic club or the Republican club are up there. The people who are going to get the newspaper endorsements, the people who can raise the money. And then why would they run headstrong into an at-large election system where they don't look to their left and look to their right and see people winning elections? So they're thinking, their thinking isn't wrong to not run, but create a district where now they actually think I can run for less money. I'm not having to run against people who've run for this office for 20 years. It creates opportunity. And in that first election, they actually did, I think, have to appoint somebody from the south of
Mhm.
Main Street area.
Yeah.
But in subsequent elections, they've actually found
Yeah.
candidates. People have created political strength. People
Nice.
now in the southern part of the city have the phone number of the editor of the Woodland
Yeah.
Daily. They know who the people are who are political, influential. So it does change the city in that case, and it can, having election opportunities actually can empower those communities that otherwise didn't,
Yeah.
for all those reasons.
Yeah. Great example. Great example.
Small districts, there is no real exemption for small districts. And so sometimes I've seen really, really small districts that are being put in a position of having to convert to district elections. And I understand that. There is a city of Brawley, I think it is, or I'll remember what it is, but it's a city that has districts that are about 130 people, 130 voters in each district. But that actually is a city that's been in districts forever. It's not a CVRA conversion. It's just, that's how they've always been. This issue of trustees only caring about constituents in their area, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because they might say, historically, we were neglected. Now we at least have a council member or a school board member that cares about us. So we have somebody who will care for our district. The other, like you're saying, is that you might create a culture where the elected officials are only caring about the area from which they're elected and not the entire needs of the agency. Now, one great example of this is, again, Sacramento, nearby where I live. The council members, when I went in and met with a council member, they actually had on their door their name and then the neighborhoods they represented. Like literally, it was like a plaque on everybody's door. And it reinforced this culture of otherism. Like, this is our district, everybody else is the others.
Interesting.
Agencies can choose to embrace that kind of culture, or they can choose to dismiss that kind of culture. We just did a conversion for a Parks and Rec district in Hayward. And in their motion to convert to districts, they said, we are accepting these districts, but we are going to continue to work as a agency with the interests of the entire jurisdiction, and, as our guiding, principle. So there are ways to mitigate that concern. And it has to do with culture. The other issues around, whether or not a small district might invite outside groups to fund or get engaged. Again, another double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Maybe the, community that wants to increase their political power in the school district didn't previously feel like they had a voice, and now they see an opportunity and they go for it. That's not necessarily an indictment of the system. It means that maybe something's working. And on the other hand, you might have some people who, think, yeah, this is all part of the democratic process, I guess, is a way of saying that. And then finally, yeah, if there's a group that has dominated in elections and now they don't dominate in the entire jurisdiction, and they are frustrated because they can no longer influence the outcome of elections in other areas, that's also part of the process. I wish that my vote could be transferred to a congressional district, say in Pennsylvania, but it can't. I vote in my own district, and it's something that we've come to accept in a lot of other elections.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. No, I appreciate that context. It's such a powerful amount of information to consider, right, as the board thinks about next steps. And so I do, before we open it up for others to have some questions for the panel, I want to ask Superintendent Mikulik if you want to chime in any way around context. I know you shared a little bit earlier, but if you want to reiterate anything before we open it up for our community members who have joined us today, for any questions that they may have. I want to see if you want to chime in before we get to that space.
Sure.
And it was Bradbury, and Council District 1 in Bradbury has 92 voters in 32 households.
Wow.
That is small.
I know.
Wow.
Yeah, to provide a little context, we've been talking about this for a while as a board, as a governance team. And really what this came out of was we wanted to hear from the public first. The board was really desiring to hear, what does the public think? What does the community think? Do they think that we should stay at large, or they think we should go to by area? And I know that there is the California Voting Rights Act that is encouraging to go to by area, but one of the rationales is that the voting block. And so that's why we did the racially polarized voting to see, is this an issue in our district? And Paul from Redistricting Partners, he and his team did an analysis for us, and it was low to insignificant. So it begs the question, is this necessary? Do we
Right.
want to? Is this going to be, like thinking about the pros and the cons? Sometimes we do have a hard time to get candidates. And so is that going to cause an issue for us? And so it was great to hear the perspective from the other districts to help the board decide. So, this is why we're having this. We're having another one at 7 o'clock tonight. And then on October 9th, we want to hear from the public. What do you, because the board meeting is a meeting for the board to conduct business. And so there is an opportunity for the public to share their opinion with the board. The board can't respond, but they can listen, and then they can make a decision later. So we just wanted to, this was the whole purpose of today, was to really hear more about it, learn, and then hear questions from the community that we can answer. And then we can also post some frequently asked questions from today on the website too.
Powerful. No, appreciate that. Definitely. And what I'll share just before we open it up for any of our participants or attendees, so be thinking about your questions, but these are the questions we asked, and I know we have them in several languages, so I just want to share those for a moment, that these are the questions that have been addressed today, and we'll continue to address in our later session. And also we hope that the public hearing, these questions will actually trigger some questions that you may have and input that you may have. So just want to share these were what our discussion points were. And so we have our languages in English and Spanish, as well as Tagalog. Also, as well as our Arabic and Chinese. And so I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to have their questions answered. But I want to open up the opportunity for our community members to actually have any questions. And so this is the opportunity for you to go into the Q&A feature in our Zoom space and type in any questions that you have. And we will have our panelists try to chime in and give any context. So I see Aaron and Ashley and Clay and Christina, and I think it's Diana Casilla, and then Gladys. And so if any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please put those in the Q&A now. And so we have one from Christina, and Christina asked about, would Bayshore residents be included in the district as well, since students in this district are going to be in JESD in high school?
So I can answer that question. Okay. We are actually two separate districts. So Bayshore Elementary is K-8, and we are also, TK pre-K-8. So we're two separate districts serving two different areas of Daly City. So Bayshore community is also in Daly City. We don't serve students that are in the Bayshore boundaries of the school district. The high school district does serve Bayshore, but they're a separate district. They just happen to have a similar name to us. We're Jefferson Elementary, TK through 8th grade. They're Jefferson Union High School District. And so they serve Pacifica and all parts of Daly City and Broadmoor and Colma. So we actually are separate districts. And so this would not be, anyone who is living in the Bayshore attendance boundaries would not be voting or part of this process. That would be through the Bayshore School District Governing Board.
Great question. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christina. Hopefully that answered the question. Great question, though, for clarity. Anyone else have a question you want to ask the panel? So anyone, Aaron, Ashley, Clay, Gladys. I want to say it's Dionasia, but I don't want to mispronounce it. So please, please, please forgive me for that. But any of you have additional questions for our panelists? I know there was a lot of information given and a lot of questions answered, so I think the panelists did a great job of doing so. But I do want to, before we close out, just encourage the group to think about. So thank you, Ashley. Ashley just said no questions. We really appreciate the background and transparency. Absolutely, Ashley. Thank you for that feedback. And definitely want to encourage anyone who has additional questions, definitely reach out. There are some resources that you can actually tap into. And again, on October 9th, there actually is the input session to continue this conversation at the school board office in the boardroom in particular. So those of you
May
that
I
don't know what
jump
that
in
is,
and give a
yeah,
little clarity around that?
please, please, please.
Actually not an input session, it's a public hearing. And
Yeah,
so
apologies.
there's an opportunity at the beginning of the meeting. So the meeting starts at 7. And so we'll do the roll and we do the Pledge of Allegiance, and then it goes pretty much right into the public hearing. And the public hearing is a time where you get a speaker card, you usually get 2 minutes, and then you can speak to the board for 2 minutes on the topic, which is this on should we transition to by trustee area elections or stay at large. And the board will listen. The board cannot respond. That is not, they're not allowed to respond. So they will listen, they'll gather that information and, you know, they'll keep it in their head, they'll write it down, and then later they'll determine, make a decision. So the public hearing is really just so that you can share your input through a public hearing process. So it's a very formal process. If you have more questions or you have other comments, if you go to the website that is on this slide here, there is a link that gives you an opportunity to fill out a form that says, what questions or comments do you have? So we'll be collecting that. So if you do have comments or thoughts come to you after this meeting, please go to that website. You can use the QR code, or you just go to our district website under Governing Board, California Voting Rights Act. You click there and then you'll see a spot where it'll say, give us feedback or ask your questions, and click on that link. It'll bring you to a Google form and you can enter your questions there. And then we'll take from there, if there are lots of questions or if there's things that need clarity, we'll then post frequently asked questions on that same page.
Excellent, excellent. Powerful opportunities. And just really appreciate you all being a panel of expertise and also information. And as Ashley shared, just transparency to really make sure the community understands the process. And so definitely there was one other question about our 7 o'clock Zoom webinar. So yes, that will happen again at 7 o'clock, and we will repeat information and continue. There will be new people that may join. You are welcome to rejoin us. And we will continue to have this information shared. And again, the website, always go to that for more information, but we encourage as many as possible to participate in the public hearing. And so thank you so much, Sandy McCulloch. We appreciate you as amazing superintendent. Thank you so much, Paul Mitchell, for being here to share context about the election. So helpful. We know our President Shaquille was unable to stay for the entire time. However, we look forward to seeing him again at 7 p.m. And again, Regina Martinez, our Spanish interpreter, thank you so much for joining us. For Aaron, Ashley Clay, Christina Dionacia, and Gladys, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you so much, and stay encouraged on your journey. And just thank you for entrusting the school district to support your community, your students, and you collectively. So thanks so much. And we'll see everyone again at 7 p.m. for those that can join. Any final thoughts, Sandy or Paul, as we close out?
No, just thank you for being part of this. And like we said, this is recorded. So this and the 7 o'clock will be posted on that same webpage that you're seeing on the screen right now.
Excellent. Well, everyone have a great evening. And again, stay encouraged.